Welcome to the second in a series of frontline online events marking 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union. My name is James Rodgers, and this is a subject which is very dear to me, both professionally and personally. My first international assignment as a journalist was to Moscow in June 1991, at the beginning of what turned out to be the last summer of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I reflected on that in my recent book, Assignment Moscow, reporting on Russia from Lenin to Putin, which also includes the reflections of a lot of other correspondents from that early post-Soviet period. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to a prolonged period of political uncertainty and economic hardship. It also led to war, first in Chechnya, and then later in Georgia and Ukraine, as those countries sought to define their post-Soviet foreign and defense policies. And Russia has also flexed its muscles in the Middle East, recently intervening decisively in the civil war in Syria. Those are just some of the subjects that we're going to be talking about in the next hour. But first, let me introduce the panel. I mentioned the Moscow correspondents I interviewed for Assignment Moscow. One of them is with us tonight, Matthew Chance, Senior International Correspondent for CNN, a role in which he has reported for many years from Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm also delighted to welcome Olga Ivshina, a BBC journalist who's reported on the conflict in eastern Ukraine and has also investigated Russian mercenaries in Africa and in Syria. And Russia's role in that last conflict is one of the issues our other guest has covered in her excellent book, Russia's Military Revival. Bettina Renz is Professor of International Security at the University of Nottingham. Her book was praised by the respected analyst Dmitry Trenin as a work that should be read by anyone wanting to get beyond the black and white picture of the West's relations with Russia. Welcome to you all. Now, our discussion will last for 30 or 35 minutes and we'll give plenty of time for questions. So if you want to put questions to the panel, please do so in the Q&A and I'll pick those up from there later on. And I want to begin, though, by coming to you, Matthew. I think we first met on a Russian army organized tour for journalists to Chechnya in 2000 at the end of that second Chechen war. And I know you also covered the attack on the school in Beslan and the Moscow theater siege. And you also reported on the war in Georgia in 2008. And I'd like to come on to that a little bit later. But what about the conflict in the North Caucasus? What sense did those events give you of the Russian military and security policy in the early years of the Putin presidency, and what was it like to report on them?
Well, can I start by saying you don't look a day older, James, than when I saw you, what was it, 21 years ago, on the back of that APC, I think it was, as we went into Grozny. And, I often think about that episode, actually, because it was this, what, I mean, how shocking was it, really? I'm still shocked by it now, that the Russians took us in to a city they'd completely leveled, and said, "Look, hey, look what we've got. They created a desert and called it peace." It's a classic example of that. They'd leveled Grozny. There wasn't a building, as you remember, that was left standing, and there were thousands of people, perhaps many thousands of people that had been hiding from the horrific barrage in cellars in those buildings. And I still don't really know. And I've not seen any real reporting on what happened to those people. Did they just sort of get up and get on with their lives? I hope they did. A lot of people did, obviously, but a lot of them were just never accounted for. And that still stays with me now from that episode when we, as you rightly say, when we first met. And I think it contrasts. I mean, I know this is something you want to talk about later, but I think it contrasts that sort of unvarnished, presentation of the reality of the situation is something that I kind of miss in Russia today. It's something you don't get in the more recent conflicts that we've all been witnessing, and I covered Georgia, as you say, and Ukraine and Syria and all the other sort of hybrid adventures that Russia has been engaged in. And you never really know what the reality is, what the truth is. You have to, you have to look very hard to find the truth. And those conflicts in the North Caucasus back in the early days of the Putin, regime, and I wasn't in Russia, before that. So I came just before he came. And that's when I started interacting with Russia. So I didn't cover the first Chechen war, for instance. So I don't know what it was like then. But what we've witnessed over the years is the slow erosion of that willingness to put the truth out there, no matter how rough it is. I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether anyone else agrees with me on that, but that's one of my sort of few observations.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense in which the military and the media operations have together become a little more sophisticated, certainly over the last couple of decades. Bettina, but I think Matthew raises the point at the beginning of the Putin presidency. I'd like to come to you next, if I may. I mean, in your book, you talk about, it was in March 2000, as the Second Chechen War was coming to an end, that Putin was first elected president. More than 20 years ago now, of course, that he's been right at the top of Russian politics. And you make the point in your book that on the eve of that election, what was to prove to be a first-round election victory, he gave a televised address in which he talked about the president, and he stressed this, about the president being the supreme commander of the armed forces. I mean, do you think, particularly with hindsight and also with an analytical eye on that particular speech, we could see then that this military aspect was going to be a very important part of the Putin presidency?
This is true, of course. Putin, of course, ran on the platform, I would say, above all, of restoring, as and I'm reading out his quote here, restoring the country's prestige and leading role in the world. Of course, there was very much the perception, and this is also why he was so popular and why he was elected again and again, at least the first couple of times, that Russia had been humiliated in the eyes of the world under Yeltsin's presidency. I guess, Putin understood that actually also coverage like the sort of uncensored coverage of the First Chechen War and other military interventions by Russia and the very poor performance of the Russian military led to this situation where, as people saw it, Russia was humiliated in the eyes of the world, no longer had a say in international affairs, where slowly there was the understanding that, what from the Russian point of view, that there was an emerging US monopoly on the use of force. And of course, Putin set out to change that. People always point towards his own force structure background in the KGB. Of course, he also understood the armed forces much better than Yeltsin did, I guess, in terms of the mindset and so on. But of course, we shouldn't forget that reforming the armed forces was absolutely something that needed doing. Now, I studied the Russian military. I started sort of towards the end of the 1990s, and reading what Western analysts, also Russian analysts, wrote in the 1990s. There was an acceptance or a consensus view that the Russian armed forces needed to change and they needed to reform because of how they had performed in Chechnya. They could no longer provide security and so on to Russia, but also that this was quite a dangerous situation. Also, you don't want a massive military of unhappy officers with lots of weapons around and so on. So Putin, from the outset, and he made this clear before he was elected, prioritized military reforms. What actually happened then under Putin wasn't much different from what had been long planned and discussed. So there had been lots of military reform programs also under Yeltsin, but Putin really had the political willingness, first of all, to push these through, sometimes actually against the wishes or against the ideas of the general staff and so on. We also shouldn't forget that the financial situation was quite favorable, really, for President Putin at the time. The economy recovered massively, mostly because of the rising gas and oil prices on the world stage, which then allowed, the military or the military budget was worth a lot more all of a sudden. It didn't actually increase that much in terms of percentage of the GDP initially, but the same percentage, 3 to 4%, was actually worth a lot more all of a sudden. So there was political willingness. There was a political program in terms of restoring Russia to the world stage as a great power, and also the financial support really to push through these plans.
Yeah. Now, Olga, I mentioned in the introduction that a lot of this, the conflicts we're talking about this evening, have been part of 30 years on. The former Soviet Union still hasn't defined what the relations are. And you obviously reported from Eastern Ukraine. What was it like to report that? Because that, in a sense, I mean, it's one of those examples, I suppose, where correspondents have to bring a lot of context to their reporting. This was, in effect, unfinished business from the late 1980s and late 1990s, but one which came to have a huge effect on international affairs in the sense that it, provoked probably the biggest rift between Russia and the West after the fall of the Soviet Union. What was your experience like of covering that conflict?
Well, honestly, it felt really surreal, first of all, because, you could see, you could feel that some of those guys who were there, they are Russian, they have relation to Russian military. They're definitely not locals. Being a Russian, I can easily distinguish sort of between people who learn their Russian in Russia and people who learn their Russian and grew up, let's say, in Ukraine, in Eastern Ukraine. They just sound differently. Especially during the first months, there was sometimes there was no way to prove they are from Russian military, but just from the way they behave, even from their posture. Russian officers have very certain postures of from the way they operate their guns, from the way they talk. You could feel they're Russian officers, Russian military, but
and yet officially they weren't there.
Yeah, officially they weren't there. Or like in Crimea, you see them, they wear a new Russian uniform. When you switch off the camera and say, listen, guys, but you are Russians, right? You are from Russian cities, you are Russian contractors, you're Russian officers. They would smile to you. And even though their faces were covered, you could see they smile to that question. And still they would deflect that. They would say, no, we weren't there, or something like that. And it was such a contrasting image, just, to what Matthew was saying. I remember those pictures from Chechnya. I remember watching them from my TV being a kid in Russia. I remember that army, which was wearing whatever they could find. They didn't even have a proper uniform, because everyone was supplied from different warehouses. So one unit was wearing one uniform, the other one something else, and on top of that, they were all bringing what they could find. And then you meet completely other Russian army in Crimea. That was such, even in Georgia, when there was war in Georgia, the picture was still different. So I think during the conflict in Eastern Ukraine and during the annexation of Crimea, that was the first time we could see this new reformed Russian army, which produced completely different image. And on top of that, the PR attempt, this accompanying special informational operation was provided on a completely different level. The way this was presented in Russian media was absolutely different, and of course it was perceived in a different way back in Russia. And this also adds, I remember being a school kid, going to the army was almost equal to being sent to the cemetery. I remember how all the boys from my yard, how they were sent to army, and their mothers were crying so much as if they were sent straight to the cemetery. Now, for certain categories of population in Russia, it's quite a desirable job. I know people who give bribes to get to the army. At certain positions, it's a social lift. Some people want to do that, and moreover, society in Russia is more and more proud of the army. So, and that's why the level of people who go there and the attitude of people who go there is completely different.
Yeah, I mean, that's a massive transformation. You talk about giving bribes. I mean, in the 1990s, it was wealthy and influential parents who'd give bribes so their sons didn't have to go to the army. I remember in Chechnya in the 1990s being struck by how few soldiers I met from Moscow or St. Petersburg, and I met a lot from sort of smaller villages from beyond. Of course, one of the consequences as well, and one of the way, like so many other spheres of economic activity, Russia's military effort has also been partly privatized. Matthew, I know you had that extraordinary story from Belarus last month about a story from some time before that wasn't actually what it had seemed at the time.
Yes, well, it played out in Belarus, but the story was from Ukraine, because it was a sting operation basically run by Ukrainian intelligence, in which they tried to sort of trap Russian mercenaries into joining a military company that they'd set up so they could fly them out of Russia and basically land them in Ukraine and arrest them and prosecute them for crimes that they were alleged to have committed in eastern Ukraine. And so it was quite a complex operation. It took place over a couple of years, and in the end it all went wrong. COVID came, they were meant to fly out of Russia, instead they had to go by bus to Belarus, and they all got under suspicious circumstances, perhaps they all got detained by the Belarusians. But I think what's interesting, apart from the fact that I thought it was just a really great sort of fascinating sort of story, I think it illustrates that sort of retreat into the shadows that we've also witnessed Russia's military doing since those early wars in the North Caucasus to what we see today. Yeah, it is a privatized, in many areas, military effort, but it's also a military effort that is deniable in many cases. And so increasingly now, I mean, we all know this, of course, but for some of our viewers out there perhaps listening into this, much of Russia's military policy is these days carried out not by the regular army, but by private military contractors, by Wagner, or by whatever other iteration they appear in. And of course, so it makes getting to the truth of the matter even more difficult. There's no accountability. There's no public record of these people kind of being involved. And that's something I think that's changed dramatically in my experience over the years. And I often wonder about why they're doing that. Why do that? Money is one option, I suppose, one reason, I suppose. But I think, unfortunately, I've arrived at the conclusion that they do it, at least to some extent, because it's operating in the grey zone means that you can do unspeakable things, and yet then you can deny it. And then you can still continue to operate as a legitimate member of the international community. And I get the impression, whether it's civilian airliners being shot down, whether it's human rights abuses in the Middle East, in Syria or in Libya or wherever else private security companies operate, I get the impression, really, that it's that advantage that is that they like the most. If you like, I'm not explaining it very well, but I mean that's that
deniability, that slight distance, that sense of uncertainty. Olga, I know this is something that you've also investigated. What's your work taught you about the use of these private contractors?
Well, yeah, they first started using it. Sort of a first ball was thrown in 2013 when a small private military company deployed some Russians into Syria, and that basically was just a testing operation. Then they were deployed to eastern Ukraine, mainly to, well, as far as I understand, mainly to guard very important people. They were more as bodyguards, because this was a specific task. They needed certain people alive, and then they couldn't trust sort of this local militia powers, but still, they couldn't send the Russian officers to do that, because they needed Russian officers and Russian military to do some other things, to do some like serious military operations. And then it evolved, as far as we understand. I generally agree with Matthew, but I think one of the reasons is that, you can conduct some really bloody operations with those guys, but then you may skip them in the statistics. So when Russia started military operation in Syria, the big question back at home was, why do we do it? It's so far away. There was just this long war in Ukraine, and people were tired. And as any society, Russian people don't like coffins with their soldiers coming back home. So when they deployed those Wagner group, and they thought, one of the most bloodiest battles in Syria, then Russian military can proudly report, we had just 4 casualties, we had just 10 casualties, we had just 100 casualties. So overall, officials can say, listen, we achieved amazing goals, and our death toll is absolutely minimal. But if you count the Wagner group, their death toll is huge. And basically, since this is a private military contractors, no one is counting. If you talk to Wagner fighters, they would say there were dozens of operations which could have still be conducted successfully, but with a death toll, I don't know, 2-3 times lower. But since they're all being paid for, no one counts, those people in charge of those operations, they don't even have to think about that. It's their trump card. Yeah, send those guys. They'll make the things done, and there is zero accountability. So it's not only legal accountability, it's also or international accountability. It's sort of legitimacy of these operations at home, and zero questions mainly being asked by wider Russian society, because they think, yeah, our heroic soldiers are doing a great job, not that many coffins back home. Why to ask any questions?
Yeah. You speak very convincingly there about Syria, Olga. And Bettina, I want to come to you because this is something that you address in your book as well. Obviously, you write that the decision to use force there was determined by a specific confluence of factors. What was it that, because this really was obviously, the conflicts on the territory of the former Soviet Union are one thing. Russia would use that phrase near abroad as somewhere where it has a legitimate interest. But this was really, this move into the Middle East was really something quite different. What was it that you think persuaded Russia to move into Syria at that point? Although, as Olga's just pointed out, there was a smaller activity there prior to the big deployment in 2015.
Absolutely. There were various reasons why Russia decided to go to war in Syria, but to link that to what Matthew and Olga just said about the deniability and so on, of course, that is one aspect of the way Russia performed tactically in Syria, of course, using proxy forces and having the Wagner group and so on, being able to do unspeakable things and so on. But I think one big aspect of the Syria operation was exactly that visibility, the wanting to be seen, to be able to also engage in these kind of out-of-area operations. Of course, this was the first time where Russia deployed significant military force beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union. And actually, at the time, a lot of people still didn't expect that Russia had the capabilities to do this, to project its power that far. So actually showing off its shiny new military to the world, to show to countries like Syria and so on that Russia's support was yet again worth having, was one of the reasons why Russia decided to intervene in Syria. Of course, there were other reasons as well. People often go on about support for Assad and the strategic interests in the Middle East. Of course, these are also partially the reason, but and security issues as well. Of course, Russia is dealing with terrorism for a long time, being worried about ISIS and so on. But again, the major reason from a foreign policy perspective is again what I said earlier: the restoring Russia's place in the world as an important actor. Showing that its voice needed to be taken into account. It was a continuation of a long time criticism in Russia of Western-led regime change. The perception that in Kosovo, of course, shortly before Putin was elected in 1999, Russia could do nothing against NATO, getting rid what it saw as an ally, Milosevic, because the military was too weak. But now in Syria, with its newly revived military, it could stand up and prevent this regime change of an ally in the region.
Yeah.
May I just quickly ask, add to what Bettina was saying, just very quickly. My colleagues and I, we noticed a very interesting detail about that, about Russian policy, military policy in Syria. They basically had two variants. They could rotate one and the same units there, so basically send their best units there and keep it there. But they have chosen the other strategy, and they were rotating and sending there as many people as possible. They wouldn't just stick, let's say, with with the 5 or 10 best units and rotate people from there. No, they would try to take involve as many various units as possible to send them all to Syria, maybe on a shorter period, but still. So I think they wanted to test their army and their capabilities and their weaponry on a grand scale to test it, but on the other hand also to provide an experience to army service.
James, if I can, I just say there's an interesting trend. I mean, I've written a list in front of me of the various conflicts that you mentioned you wanted to discuss: Chechnya, Beslan, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, to some extent the Middle East African interventions that we're witnessing as well. And as you trace down that list chronologically, it's sort of unavoidable to see this trend of like moving away their focus from regional, local, control disputes like in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus, and to an extent in Beslan as well, to Georgia, which I still don't fully understand, the objectives in Georgia. But anyway, in Georgia as well, which is much more of a, to some extent, creating these quasi-autonomous states on Russia's borders, a sort of regional issue. And then you start moving from Georgia into more geopolitical adventures in Ukraine to prevent it joining Western institutions, or to destabilize the neighboring country and to create a buffer state, prevent pro-Western forces taking over. In Syria, to show that Russia is once again a player on the international stage. The interventions in the Central African Republic and wherever else they're active through their private military companies, or Wagner, if it's just one, there as well. They've taken on over the years, since 2000, since Putin came to power, a much more geopolitical flavor. And I think that's something that's, a feature of the past 20 years in Russian military conflict.
Yeah, and that's the next point I want to come on to, actually, Matthew. So thank you for raising that. We'll come to your questions very shortly. We'll just, a couple more points I want to put to the panel, because just picking up on that, it seemed to me as a correspondent who covered both Chechen wars as well as reporting from South Ossetia, both before and after the 2008 war, that Russia was learning as it went along. I mean, the first war in Chechnya was a disaster, countless conscript and civilian casualties, and the rebels weren't defeated after all. In the second war, they learned from that, and the military performance improved in the 2008 war over South Ossetia, even though things weren't perfect. I mean, I remember being on one of those trips and a Russian army officer asking from the assembled journalists if anybody had a work mobile phone, because he wanted to make a couple of phone calls home and he didn't want to use up his own phone card credit. It just wasn't really sort of that impressive. But Matthew, I mean, you mentioned that, how important an event was South Ossetia? You said you didn't quite understand the conflict even now, but clearly, I mean, I think I would argue that it was something that, Russia did learn important lessons, both by that time, as you will remember, they were employing Western PR agencies to spin for them and inviting Western correspondents to have interviews with leading players to whom we almost never had access otherwise. But what was it like to report that 5-day war, which is sort of forgotten, but I think is actually very significant in the development of what we're discussing tonight?
You're probably right. I mean, I definitely think it was a sort of turning point in many ways, because they were dipping their toes into the waters of wrestling with the idea of the unvarnished truth that I mentioned earlier, that we witnessed in the North Caucasus, to using Western PR agencies to sort of put out a sort of sanitized version, or their version of what they wanted to communicate. And I think I got the impression that they didn't like that model. They decided to go a different path after Georgia. But militarily, you're right. This is Russia, concerned about the Western lurch of a country on its frontiers, in its backyard, sort of intervening to make sure that didn't happen. And then you see the more geopolitical continuation of that in Ukraine and in Syria. And of course, that mirrors, I mean, as Bettina was saying, that mirrors the changing ambitions of the Kremlin over those years as well. The idea that Russia is back has been a mantra of the Putin regime. It's, as Bettina said, it's made him popular. It's why he was so popular, restoring Russia's pride in its standing on the international stage is one of the reasons why, I think Putin is still, popular among a very big constituency inside Russia. And and yes, the Georgia conflict, you're right, was them experimenting with how far they could go with that.
Thank you. And we're going to take some questions now. There's a couple of questions, interestingly, and perhaps topically, given what a lot of the other rest of the international news agenda is influenced by, about focused on energy, in fact. Fatma is asking, why can't Europe accept Russia as a neighbor and that we need them in order to have a reasonable energy resource? And Yanis is asking, what does the West have to do to confront Russia, in particular when NATO members such as Germany are signing trade deals for gas with the Russian regime? Any thoughts on that from the panel on this political and quasi-military confrontation, or certainly fallout over Russia's military actions? And indeed, I think it's interesting to mention Kosovo too, because I remember when I was in South Ossetia in 2006, it was very much quoted as a precedent about why Russia, if the West could recognize Kosovo, then in the same way Russia could recognize South Ossetia. It seemed like a minor footnote at the time, but then of course 2 years later it was war. But how does this play out, this reliance on energy, and at the same time this lack of diplomatic confrontation?
I just say one thing very short, and I'll let everybody else take over because I don't feel competent to answer this. But I will say that what I think this energy crisis is underlined, is the raw power that Russia has in Europe. I mean, Europe still, despite its its concerns, still very much depends on Russia for its energy supplies, and Putin knows it. I mean, you can see him sort of strutting on the international stage, making that point as he, basically lectures Europe on how they've conducted themselves when it comes to energy policy. And I think he knows very well that Russia still holds the cards, despite the efforts to take them away from him when it comes to energy policy.
Well, I think it's all part of a grand game. On the one hand, yes, Europe depends on Russian gas, on Russian energy. On the other hand, Russia is not Soviet Union. Soviet Union was very well it was very closed country, but it was that's why it performed well on building internal chains of supply. Internal production was quite developed, and they could do things without many things were produced internally. Now Russia is way more dependable from international markets. If we remember back in 2014, when West first introduced sanctions because of Crimea and then because of Eastern Ukraine and MH17, it was a big hit for Russian market, not because of the sanctions themselves, but because Putin has introduced counter sanctions, banning Western produce, Western vegetables, cheese, whatever, entering Russia. And suddenly, for some time, shelves in Russian supermarkets, they were half empty because and it took Russian agriculture a few years to develop at least some possibilities to fill in those shelves. And even now, if you ask some Russians, they will say, "Oh, well, we still miss Western cheese." So it's complicated. Yes, Europe depends on Russian gas, but Russia depends on certain produce from Europe as well, and Putin knows that perfectly. Exactly, that's why I think he's playing that game, because he sees world as a grand chessboard, and he moves pawns. Okay, I have some advantage here, some leverage here, but I have a soft spot, a weak spot there. So he tries to exchange those pawns on a chessboard.
Yeah, thank you. I'll refrain from the opportunity to discuss about how long what that might teach us about the shelves filling up in this country, but thank you for that observation. Olga, the next question I want to take is from Robert Wallace, which says, how much can Russia's current expansionism be traced back to NATO's expansion in the 1990s, contrary to earlier Bush 1 era assurances that NATO would be restrained? Bettina, I'd like to put that question to you first, please, but it's interesting to note, Mr. Wallace, that it depends on whose account you read. Those sort of assurances are now publicly at least denied, but you're absolutely right. They are very, very widely believed in Russia. Bettina, any thoughts on that, on this idea of NATO?
I mean, there has been quite a lot of research done in the last couple of years, again, whether Russia was ever given any assurances or not. But I think in a way it doesn't matter whether they were given in written form and like an absolutely unambiguous way or not. It is clear that it's not only the last couple of years that Russia has believed that they were given these assurances in the 1990s that NATO would not expand eastwards. And of course, NATO expansion and Russian concerns about that, that has shaped Russian views of the West and of NATO and the US in particular for a long time, and dating back to before Putin was elected president in Russia as well. And again, I would like to point out that the war in Kosovo, Operation Allied Force, was an absolute turning point in Russia's view on NATO and view on the utility of force in general. So Russia has been at least consistent in the argument that NATO enlargement is something that would go against their national interests and would be an issue, not a security threat as in fear of NATO invading, but encroaching on their sphere of influence and so on. It's nothing new. It shouldn't have come, therefore, as a surprise that after the NATO summit in 2008, when NATO said that both Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members in the future. Of course, they didn't put a certain date on it or didn't even promise a membership action plan, that this would not be met with happiness and agreement in Moscow particularly. And of course, when Putin gave his famous Crimea speech in March 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, he went on about the West and blaming NATO and NATO enlargement, at least implicitly, for his decision to annex Crimea. Of course, it doesn't mean that that made it right, but certainly it has been used as a reason to justify these actions. So I think, yeah, and this continues, of course, to be a big question. It actually is an even more significant question now, especially for Ukraine and Georgia. Does Russia have red lines in this respect? Would Ukrainian NATO membership be a red line for Russia, and what would that mean for NATO and for Ukraine? And of course, in that sense, it's a serious issue for Ukraine's and Georgia's ability to choose their own foreign policy to some extent.
Yeah, another area of conflict which we haven't considered, we've talked about various geographical locations and regions. We haven't talked yet about cyber conflict. So I want to take a question now from Benjamin Cook, who says, as of yet, the law of armed conflict does not apply in the cyber domain. How will the inevitable establishment of laws, regulations for cyber warfare affect already brittle relationships between Russia and other great powers, particularly when it comes to sanctioning any breaches made? Any thoughts on that?
Well, as far as we know with cyber, the policy adopted by Russian officials is the one of denial. They always say, it may be some, first of all, it's not us. Secondly, even if they had, I don't know, Russian IP addresses, or they operate in Russian, in Moscow working hours, or they use some Cyrillic, in the coding, they would say it might be some patriotic citizens just operating on their own. It's not us. So that's the trouble with this. On the one hand, we do know there are cyber units within Russian military. There are cyber units within within GRU, Russian military intelligence. There are cyber units within SVR, Russian analog of MI6, but they're operating in the shadows, and it's really, really hard to distinguish whether these are the state-sponsored units or whether they are some really volunteer hackers. And we can't imply they're state-funded just by definition. And also the border between those two is very narrow, because it's a policy widely used everywhere, not only in Russia, but also in the United States and elsewhere. If you're a talented hacker and you are caught red-handed, then you might make a deal with the government, exchanging your talent to the possibility not to sit in prison.
And to say it's not just whether the hackers are state-funded or not. It's whether Russia will be prepared to move against hackers who have been identified, for instance, by the United States. I mean, I've been speaking to some senior US officials recently, and they said, look, we've handed the names, the evidence, the data over to Russian officials about ransomware attacks that have taken place in the US. There's been some big ones, of course, the Colonial Pipeline that sort of brought the energy distribution system to a standstill across the eastern seaboard. I can't remember the name of the place, but the attack against the food packaging, the meat packaging company led to all sorts of problems as well. And there's been sanctions imposed because of that from the United States, but there's been no discernible action taken by the Russians to combat it or to arrest the people that have had the finger of blame pointed at them. And so I think we're currently in a situation where the US, which is trying, for want of a better word, to reset the relationship. It's not calling it that, but that's what it's trying to do. It's testing the Russians to see whether they are prepared to move against individuals who they've given the names of. And we'll see. I mean, nothing has happened yet, but everybody's watching it.
Yeah, Matthew, I wanted to ask you, I mean, looking back over sort of 20 odd years, moving away from from cyber media and thinking more about, conventional media reporting. We saw recently the expulsion of a BBC correspondent, Sarah Rainsford, from Moscow. How's it been, for you? Did you feel that the way that you've been treated by the Russian authorities has changed? Has it remained more or less constant? Has it got difficult or easier? What's it like to report from Russia these days?
Well, I mean, funnily enough, I was having a conversation with a number of colleagues earlier, and everybody's got different experiences. I mean, Sarah Rainsford, obviously the BBC correspondent who was expelled after many years of excellent reporting in the country, and that's she was very upset about it, as were many of her colleagues. I mean, she was obviously targeted, not for personal reasons, but because the Russians wanted to find a way of sort of hitting a state broadcaster from Britain. They said, I think it was in response to the failure of a Russian journalist to get a visa in Britain, whatever. They identified her as somebody who they could, in a tit for tat way, kind of get rid of, and it would send a message to Britain. My experience has been, I think, somewhat more insulated. They treat CNN with a little bit more, I suppose, neglect. We don't get much access. We don't. If whatever we report, the state media will pick up on and kind of do whole kind of segments in their news shows about something I said they don't agree with, or something I said they do agree with, and so you get a bit of that kind of pressure. But we're basically neglected by the officials. We don't get a lot of access, a little bit, but not a lot. I'm certainly, from my personal point of view, I'm certainly not conscious of being followed around, having my apartment, kind of turned over, anything like that. But I mean, some of my colleagues say that they do feel that kind of pressure, but personally, I haven't noticed it. But that's, as I was saying to my colleagues the other day, perhaps that's because I'm not as observant, or perhaps not as paranoid as some of the people.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions related to China, which I guess sort of plays into our discussion of Russia's strategy. One's asking, what does a more belligerent China mean? And a question from Michael, which forgive me if you'll forgive my shortening it, talking about the difficulties over Nord Stream has led Kiev to think about making relations with Beijing. What does China's role in the former Soviet space mean? How does Russia consider that? Bettina, would you have any thoughts on that?
So the major joint interest, of course, of Russia and China is Central Asia in many ways. There has been quite a lot of cooperation going on there. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, first of all, we've all read about even joint military activities, exercises, and so on going on. And for a long time, there was kind of the perception by analysts, I have never myself done much research on that area, that ultimately this has got to lead to some kind of conflict between Russia and China over influence in Central Asia, especially because, of course, economically, China is can offer much more to the countries in Central Asia, the former Soviet states in Central Asia, than Russia can. Also increasingly militarily, of course, China has caught up quite a bit since the 1990s. But interestingly, this doesn't have seemed to have happened. So the strategic partnership that Russia and China have, especially in Central Asia, seems to work quite well in the sense that the Chinese seem to know how to deal with the Kremlin, or how to treat the Kremlin in the sense of treating them as an equal partner, kind of accepting that in security sense, it is the Russians that have the upper hand in Central Asia, whereas economically China can offer more, accepting also that culturally and historically Russia has got more of an influence in Central Asia when it comes to knowledge of the language and so on. So there seems to be a lot of mutually beneficial interaction and so on going on. Actually, with the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan now, I would expect this cooperation between Russia and China in Central Asia to even increase, because of course they have similar security concerns over instability from Afghanistan spilling over into Central Asia and ultimately also into Russia and China as well. So I'm not too cynical from having followed it for a few years about Russian-Chinese relations. I think it is a stronger relationship than it was often assumed.
May I quickly just add to what Bettina said? A colleague of mine, Andrei Zakharov, recently went to the Russian Far East to see, how things look on the ground. And actually, politically, I absolutely agree with Bettina. It's a strong alliance, but people on the ground in certain areas of Russia are terrified because, the demographical pressure from China is huge, and the Chinese business comes to Russian cities, especially in the Far East. Chinese illegal woodcutters on a grand scale operate in the Far East. And many of the Russians living there are scared because they say, listen, our village, is half drunk or most of the day and absolutely in disaster. But you look across the river and there are huge, well-developed cities with skyscrapers, and the pressure is coming, and they are afraid in a way, they are afraid. They don't know what the future might bring. And they feel, especially Russian Far East, it feel very much detached from Moscow, and the results of recent parliamentary elections just show that the election results in the Far East are very much different from those in the European part of Russia.
Yeah, we've got a little over 10 minutes left. Olga, I just want to pick up on something that we haven't really covered in as much detail before, but your experiences in Crimea. I asked Matthew what it was like, reporting for an international media organization. What's it been like for you as a Russian reporting for an international media organization? You wrote that piece a few years ago about your experience of being detained in Crimea, where you obviously ended up somewhere where the Russian army didn't think you should be. Do you think things have got more difficult for you working in Russia and in the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, definitely. For Russian citizens, especially last year, working for international media organizations is very dangerous. My colleague, everyone in the West knows about Sarah Rainsford, but not that many people know that our colleague from BBC Russian, Andrei Zakharov, he was labeled a foreign agent last week, which basically turns his personal life to hell, because each time he pronounces a word, he must say this 20 words. This is produced by a foreign agent, and he has to report all his movements, all his, even like buying a cup of coffee each month, he has to send a report back to Russian officials. It's terrible. On personal level, it can be very dangerous. As you rightly mentioned, while I was reporting from Crimea, I ended up in the wrong part of the field around the Ukrainian base, and I had to go through mock execution. I was quite fortunate to end up alive, but that was really, really serious. So, they questioned us for a while. They blindfolded us for a while. They still couldn't believe, I ended up there occasionally. There was a danger of me being raped. So eventually I managed to convince them it's not a good idea to do that. But in the end, they said, listen, we'll let you go because we're too busy at the moment. And maybe it's a bad idea to kill you at the moment, but we'll see you in Moscow. We'll see you in Moscow, and we'll get things done later on. And it's very hard for us because if you're a Russian citizen, in a way, you have nowhere to go. They can always get you, and at least that sits at the back of your mind. I have been followed many times after, by the end of 2014, my mom, who was a professor of math back in Kazan, she was fired, basically. Officially, there was some explanation, but unofficially, she was summoned to the head of the university on 2 occasions, and each time he said, listen, you need to think. You can't be 2 things at the same time. You can't be a professor of the state-funded university and mother of a traitor, mother of an enemy of the nation. You have to choose. She have chosen me, and it costed her job. She lost her job. This is just one of the many examples which happened to us, to Russian citizens working for the international broadcasters. But that's, I guess, that's our conscious decision. That's the price we have to pay to be able to report.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reminder for people like me who haven't suffered consequences like that from our reporting. That thank you for sharing that with us. Must have been a very difficult moment for you. We've just got 8 or so minutes left, so I want to try to sort of summarize our discussion. There's a very good question, and I'll come to you first on this, Matthew, if I may, from Harry Cranston. What do you feel has been the most important factor in the revival in Russian society's faith/pride in the military from the low point of the Boys in Zinc? That's a reference, of course, to Svetlana Alexeyevich's book about Afghanistan and the first Chechen war. What's been the most important factor, would you say, Matthew?
Well, I mean, it's been a process, hasn't it? It's been a process of, quite rapid revival of Russia's military, fortunes, and it's been a concerted effort to re-establish Russia's presence as a military force on the international stage. From Georgia, its first intervention, outside the borders of Russia since the founding of the country, through Ukraine, Syria, and now what we're seeing in the Middle East and in African states. And that reminds me, by the way, talk about prices paid by journalists. There were 3 journalists killed in the Central African Republic while pursuing a story about private military contractors back in 2018. And so people do pay the ultimate price for carrying out journalism in Russia, particularly local Russian journalists who are extraordinarily brave and don't have the same kind of protections that we as international journalists do. But I mean, to answer the question, no, there's not one single moment that stands out for me, but the fact that direction of travel has been accelerated, and it's been a concerted effort to re-establish Russia as a player again on the international stage. Russia is back again, the headline of the Putin regime. Putin's period in power, I think, is an astonishing revival for the country from that period when they were kicked out of, left in humiliation from Afghanistan. Just very briefly, I don't want to go on too much, but what Bettina was saying about it being in the interests of Russia to not allow NATO expansion, something like that. It was also, NATO expansion is also a measure of Russia's impotence. I was in Kosovo, actually, as a very young journalist, extremely young, when that standoff happened. And it was a humiliation for Russia when they had to back down and allow Pristina to be, allow the Americans, or the forces into Pristina. And of course, it was that humiliation was further reiterated with the expansion of NATO. And, there's a symbolism in Russia to stopping NATO expanding any further. And there's a further symbolism by, asserting Russian control over other parts of the world. And so it's not just political, geopolitical interests. It's like it's symbolic for Putin. And again, that is a reminder of why this figure has become, such a sort of powerful icon for many Russians.
Thank you. Bettina, a last question to you, if I may. I mean, just referring to the title of your book, what would you say that Russia has gained, and perhaps counter to that, what has Russia lost from its military revival?
Right. I guess rather than just talking about the conclusion I came to in the book, I think it's important also in the view also of what Olga said to just distinguish again between the Kremlin, the Putin presidency and the leadership and Russia as a country and the Russian population. Putin has certainly won and gained in terms of personal prestige, and I completely agree with Matthew here that there's a lot about symbols, a lot about wanting respect personally, but also I guess for Russia. I guess, yeah, he has regained a certain place for Russia again on the international stage. Certainly, when I studied the Russian military, like in the beginning of the 2000s, people said, why are you doing that? Nobody's interested in Russia. That certainly is no longer the case. But to what extent is that a gain for Russia in the long term? Even the annexation of Crimea, that is often portrayed as this massive victory and so on. I mean, what has Russia gained ultimately? It is quite isolated from a lot of important actors in the world, although some other countries might look up to Russia again in a certain way. But also, in addition to the aggressive foreign policy, like Olga has said, there also is quite a lot in terms of aggressive domestic policy. So it's actually the Russian population and so on that lose out the most from the securitization of all aspects of life, restrictions on freedom of information and so on. Of course, journalists affected. I know more the academic side, young academics that can't really carry out the kind of research that they want to do. So I would say in the long term, especially the annexation of Crimea that was so clearly against international law has not benefited Russia in the long term. It is something that will be very, very difficult to reverse. It has really not helped Russia's image as a positive actor, as a reliable partner, as a friend, really, in the world for anybody. And not only for Ukraine, of course, Russia won Crimea, but lost Ukraine, but also when it comes to the other former Soviet states. And I think the Russian population, if you look at public opinion polls, people are also much more nuanced about that. So yes, people want Russia to be a great power, but when people are actually asked, what does it mean to you that Russia is a great power, on the first couple of points are always good living standards, a stable economy, and not sort of military adventures all over the world. So that would be my conclusion in that respect.
Yeah, thank you. And Olga, I'll give the last word to you. We saw that build up on troops on the border of Ukraine in the spring of this year, and we sort of, there was a lot of excitement about it, and then it didn't come to anything, as I think many of us who sort of observed these things over the years thought it might somehow fizzle out. But I'm going to ask you that difficult question for journalists to sort of gaze into the future a bit. I mean, do you see, there's been speculation too about possible disruptions focused on Russian language populations in the Baltics, possible flare-up of conflict in Ukraine again. Do you see anything like that happen? Do you sense that there is the appetite for that among the current presidential administration?
Well, yeah, it's really hard to look into the future, but I don't think any major escalations are desirable for Kremlin at the moment. Because if we look back, we may notice that those escalations always come at the time when it's economically, times which are economically favorable for the Kremlin. Because any escalation, any war, any operations, any major operations require a lot of money, a lot of resources. At the moment, Russian economy is struggling, and in the moment, the biggest battle for the Kremlin now is in Russian cities and towns, because for the last several weeks, it's extreme rise of COVID cases. People don't want to get vaccinated. They don't trust the authorities, and that's the battle I think which occupies minds of Kremlin officials at the moment. And the hate which annexation of Crimea, operations in Ukraine, in Syria had, the hate it had on Russian economy is so impressive that it's hard to think that Russia may sign up for any, at least willingly sign up for any major adventure in the future. But the way they see things, their perspective is completely different from the Western perspective. So if Mr. Putin or if Russian officials feel that they're threatened, that their sphere of influence is intervened on a grand scale, they might respond in a due fashion, as they say. So there is always things which they may see as a provocation, but as a planned action, I don't think they're going to do anything anytime soon because they just need time to recover economically.
Olga, thank you very much. Thank you to Bettina Renz and to Matthew Chance. Thank you as well to Pranvira Smith for organising this. And most of all, thank you to all of you who have joined us this evening. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but from me, James Rodgers and the rest of the panel, thank you for joining us.